And this is from a Pew Internet and American Life report last year. And I think this is very, very true. Most original reporting still comes from traditional journalists. But technology allows people to increase its impact. They're sharing across all these platforms, not just on, even on things like Facebook, where, which is fundamentally a photo sharing site. But people are still sharing news, getting it out there among their friends. It's friends, not editors, who are determining what pieces of traditional journalism are being read. So you have all these sort of complicated, swirling news cycles. I think the best read of this I've seen recently was this report earlier this year from Cornell University. And I think this sort of periodic is, sort of quite categorically established, looking at, a huge billion volume information, that on the whole, social media is reporting what's going on in the mainstream. That is fundamentally what it's doing. Yes, there's news breaking on Twitter, but almost in this raw data form. For the most part, what's being shared, what's being discussed, is a mainstream issue and is addressed by mainstream journalists. This is why we believe that sort of traditional media, the journalists we've always sort of had relationships with at Cision, we need to really understand how they're working even in this age of social media, perhaps even more so. So these surveys. You're about to see an awful lot of charts, I warn you. Okay? And some of this data is very, very new. It's so new that you'll also see a lot of default Excel chart colours. That's how new this stuff is. We're still getting our heads around it. But I think you're already starting to see some really clear patterns emerge within this stuff. But please get involved. Now, pretty much across every country in which we've done this has been the kind of breakdown that we've looked at. Experience, a lot of experience there, mainly grouped within this sort of, I've been a journalist for sort of 7 to 18 years kind of environment. But most age groups well represented within each of these surveys. A couple of them skew in slightly different directions, but broadly speaking, that's about right. Likewise, the kind of media breakdown we were looking at. Pretty good split in each territory between magazines, newspapers, broadcast, and web, including some bloggers. Not a pretty graph. There are prettier to come. But this was from the UK, and we and what we really wanted to say was we really wanted to establish some kind of technographic background of the respondents as well. So we said, well, how important are these kind of social technologies in your life in general? And we asked them to score it on 1 to 5. This big purple and this blue here, these are the people saying, yeah, it's kind of important in my life. It's quite a significant number. In my work, it's essential. Now, we asked this question in UK, Germany, France, and we saw exactly that pattern in UK, Germany, France. So even those who are not particularly kind of, keen on social media and particularly like using it in their daily life, it's essential to their work. But I think I said this yesterday when I was sort of playing this. So that, the thing about surveys is they tend to sort of encourage you to ask other questions. Because you think, oh, okay, we've got our survey now, we know the answers. We know what's going on. And then you get the responses back and you think, well, what do they mean by that? Why have they said that? Why is it, and in this particular case, why is it important? I mean, certainly within the Scandinavian surveys, it was pretty obvious that this was becoming, social media was pretty important to journalists. You can see there right across the territory, they're all reading blogs. And this is sort of, pretty often, weekly, daily. Likewise, bar Finland, they're all getting involved. Starting to get involved, maybe Finland, Denmark, but certainly Sweden, Norway, really into their microblogs. So we know that's important to them. And likewise, even good old Wikipedia, incredibly important to them. But why is it important? I mean, we looked in the US as well, and they just came out, in a very sort of US style. Is it important? 56% said it was very important. But when we were reading these surveys and we'd sort of fill it with Cision Research Europe, we're saying, well, why is it important? What are they using this stuff for? There's a lot of different ways they could be using this. And how is it changing? going to take you back to 2007. This is the blue is I used this stuff more than 3 years ago. So you can see, you know, I mean, search, which I thought was pretty well established 3 years ago, it's becoming increasingly used over the past 3 years. Social media, absolutely. But I think communicators, corporate sites, press releases, not going anywhere. So these new technologies are supplementing. They're continuing to use the traditional tools as well, but using them in conjunction, more and more so with new tools. Again, exactly the same pattern in Germany and in France. Almost identical. Quite compelling stuff. And this, you know, so that's the difference between when Philip was getting his responses. So when, you know, when the comms were saying, look, you know, we just want to do this so we can show people that we can do it. This is to now, where it's really being used by the journalists. And so if you're a communicator, you yourself need to be able to use it. This is from the US survey. And obviously, you know, they asked, what are you using? Which sites are you using? But again, you know, when we're sat there looking at this thinking, well, okay, they use, so they use YouTube. Okay, they use YouTube. How are they using these things? They're using them a lot. Very often, they're using them all the time. How are they using them? What are they using them for? So we sort of tried to look across that news cycle. And we tried to think, well, you know, how are you putting your stories together? And basically within the survey, we tried to identify, I guess, sort of three main phases. Sourcing the story, researching, validating, and fact-checking, which is, of course, that, you know, that most elusive journalistic quality, that one they're most proud of, and that one they sort of are so dismissive about in other media, and then promoting their work. This is kind of shows the proportion of journalists in the UK using for sourcing stories, so discovering, and they're using it sometimes, which we define as kind of once a week, often more than once a week, all the time, every day. That's how we're defining these areas. I think within the UK, what I really want to draw your attention to here is a fairly broad use of social networks, and in particular, Twitter. As popular as anything else. And I really like this idea of sort of, you know, these sort of crowdsourced stories coming out of that raw data, where the journalists are actually calling out for it, actually saying, you know, who's got a story for me? There's one particular technologist in journalism, very, very famous technology journalist in Britain called Charles Arthur. And he is absolutely explicit about the fact he wants to receive no communications from any PRs apart from on Twitter. Pitch me on Twitter, is what he says. And this is one of the most influential tech journalists in the country. He's not alone. People are starting to work in this way. But you'll note if you go to sort of France that sort of diminishes that proportion there. Whereas there's still sort of, it's quite a similar level of sort of social media that they're using. They're still using kind of, you know, they're using slightly more, sort of leaning slightly more towards blogs and social networks, but less on the sort of micro stuff. And likewise, a similar thing in Germany, but I want you to keep your eye on when I do this. Next slide. That Wikipedia slice was kind of similar for UK and France. Starts to get really big in Germany. And this is at a sourcing level. So actually discovering your stories through something like Wikipedia, incredible thing. The consistency also throughout those charts of things like personal contacts, search engines, corporate sites. I think if you go back, you'll see the PRs as well within the other two. There were more significant activities in England and France. In Germany, seems to be something going on with traditional communications relationships. You'll see it again. Okay, so let's go to sort of validating, researching, fact-checking. Now, obviously, as you'd expect, personal contacts and search, these things swell. Corporate sites, the same. Communicators as well. Really, really key role when people are researching further, digging down, fact-checking,